How the USA and USSR met in orbit in 1975. On July 5th, 1975, putting aside Cold War prejudices, representatives of the USSR and the USA proved to the entire world that in the future, space exploration would become a joint endeavour of the great powers. The docking of the Soviet Soyuz-19 and the American Apollo marked a milestone in the era of détente. And Here the Space channel recalls how it happened. Détente, from Earth to sky. In the early 1970s, as the Soviet Union achieved military strategic parity with the USA, the rigid confrontation between Moscow and Washington gave way to negotiations. Treaties on the reduction of nuclear weapons were prepared, cultural and scientific cooperation began, and sporting competitions for the best athletes of the two superpowers were organised. General Secretary of the CPSU Central Committee Leonid Brezhnev and US President Richard Nixon met as friends and spoke of détente of international tension. It seemed the Cold War was behind them, with the peaceful coexistence of systems ahead, and the détente that began on Earth needed to be extended into space. Cooperation between different systems beyond Earth seemed inevitable even before the start of the space era. As early as 1950, American science fiction writer Frederick Brown published the novella Honeymoon in Hell, in which a Soviet female pilot and an American pilot go to the moon to save humanity. And in Martin Kaydin's novel Marooned, 1964, an American astronaut was on the brink of death during a flight. His ship ran out of oxygen, but simultaneously in orbit was the Soviet Vostok, rushing to the Americans' aid. The idea of a real orbital docking was proposed by Thomas Paine, director of the American Space Research Administration, in correspondence with Mstislav Keldysh, president of the USSR Academy of Sciences. Soviet specialists agreed to this initiative. In October 1970, the first working meeting of Soviet and American specialists took place in Moscow. The main question they discussed, setting aside secrecy and using blueprints and calculations, was how to combine the rendezvous and docking systems used in the USSR and the USA. Another equally important task was to ensure that both ships would launch into orbit at the same altitude and inclination and be able to approach each other. The computer systems for calculating motion differed between Soviet and American ships. The Americans had to switch to the metric system, abandoning feet and pounds. After long consultations and debates, the chosen altitude was 225 kilometers, and the orbital inclination was 51.8 degrees, determined by the geographical location of Baikonur. On May 24, 1972, in Moscow, Chairman of the Council of Ministers of the USSR, Alexei Kosygin, and US President Richard Nixon signed the Agreement on Cooperation in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space for Peaceful Purposes. A project called the Apollo-Soyuz Test Project was born. Then the routine work began. Americans learned Russian and Russians learned American English. Intensive training for Soviet and American cosmonauts took place in 1974 to 1975, training at Star City and the Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center. They grew accustomed to each other psychologically and linguistically. Soviet and American spacecraft had fundamental technical differences. Designers had a lot to adjust for joint work in orbit. The most complex technical challenge was creating new, compatible docking elements. Handshake in orbit. On July 15, 1975, at 3:20 p.m. Moscow time, the Soyuz-19 spacecraft with Leonov and Kubasov on board launched from Baikonur. 7 hours later, the Apollo spacecraft with a crew of 3 astronauts, Thomas Stafford, Vance Brand, and Donald Slayton, successfully launched from Cape Canaveral. Stafford and Slayton's friendly rendezvous with the Soviet cosmonauts aboard Soyuz was supposed to take place when the ships flew over Moscow. The Americans visited their Soviet friends. The ballistic experts calculated everything. The cosmonauts precisely carried out the task. But, for some mysterious reason, something didn't align. And so, they shook hands when the ships flew over the Elbe, which prompted journalists to recall 1945 and the fraternization of Soviet and American Allied soldiers on the bank of that German river. The hosts embraced the guests and exchanged souvenirs. The Americans were convinced that their ship was more comfortable and powerful. Indeed, at that time, the USSR had focused on improving orbital stations, with ships playing more of an auxiliary role. But the living conditions on Soyuz surprised the guests. Firstly, the air on the Soviet ship was better. Secondly, everyone admired the toilet, designed on the principle of a vacuum cleaner. A far less convenient model was used on Apollo. The flight was not limited to friendly conversations, embraces, and jokes. The International Space Crew conducted many scientific experiments. For almost 2 days, Soyuz and Apollo flew in orbit, embraced, transforming into a single space laboratory. 4 times, representatives of the USSR and the USA visited each other, but there was still undocking and a second docking to come, in which Soyuz was to play the active role. Again, a dangerous experiment with a happy outcome. The ships flew in a docked state for another 3 hours, after which they separated, but the cosmonauts and astronauts remained friends forever. Space Brotherhood. In both the USSR and the USA, the Space Brothers were welcomed as true heroes. They met with heads of state, Leonid Brezhnev and Gerald Ford, and spoke before scientists, demonstrating to the entire world that they had found common ground. Millions of people on all continents then perceived the handshake in space as a guarantee that the two powers had overcome the danger of atomic war. A more striking symbol of détente was impossible to imagine.